Okay. So I'm not an adoption researcher. So there's a question of why am I here talking to you. I do study adolescent depression, and I'm particularly interested in understanding what it is about adolescents' close relationships with their parents and with their girlfriends and boyfriends that may create vulnerabilities for depression, or on the other hand, help relieve depression or protect adolescents from developing serious depression. And so I'm here today to try to see with you if any of the insights that we're gleaning about research with adolescent depression and close relationships in general might be relevant to adoptive adolescents and families. Now, we know that two of the most striking things about depression begin in adolescence, and that is, first, the remarkably high prevalence in our population of depression. 16% of us during our lifetimes will experience clinically significant depression. And the second remarkable striking aspect that appears in adolescence is the beginning of this gender difference, and it's a very striking gender difference. And as you know, women are 2 to 3 times more likely than boys and men to develop depression, and that begins, as you can see, here in adolescence. And we do know that adopted adolescents also have an increased vulnerability for depression. So in my research, we examine a wide range of factors that create risk for depression. We look at early family history, early trauma, those kinds of stressors. We look at cognitive risks or consistent negative ways of thinking about stress. We look at personality risks, negative personality risks, and particularly ones that have to do with interpersonal relationships, and this is a place where attachment styles would come in. We look at off-time pubertal maturation, particularly early maturation, and particularly for girls as a risk factor. But the part that we're very, very interested in is how those elements may feed into relationship stress. And we look at relationship stress experimentally through direct observation of adolescents and their parents and adolescent dating couples. Megan had talked about the Trier stress task, where you're given a performance task, doing math in front of an audience and so forth. We do real life tasks. So we have parents and adolescents and dating couples fighting in front of us, or in front of cameras. And we're not in the room, but these are real-life conflicts that are unresolved in their relationships. And we examine their physiological stress reactions to those conflicts. And though we look at, as I was saying, the early life stressors and abuse and neglect, parental loss, other kinds of stressors, we think those are incredibly, fundamentally important. But we want to look also at the added stress of chronic relationship stress. And we're very interested at this during those adolescent years, conceptualizing of it as perhaps low level but insidious, non-traumatic, normative, but still producing chronic stress. If you don't develop ways of coping with fighting with the people that you love. I have to say from the very beginning that I want to state we take fighting with the people you love as a normative, human, universal sort of task that we've all got to figure out how to deal with. And we, throughout our life, are figuring out ways of coping with that task. And one reason we struggle with trying to figure out effective coping strategies for this, of course, is to really try and ensure that we stay in our close relationships. We want to protect our relationships. We want to take care of those people that we love. Even if we're adolescents, that might be thinking that we need to protect or take care of our parents when we're having conflict with them. That might be a particular worry for some adopted children. And the difficult part in working hard to maintain your relationship and take care of this partner that you care about, but you have real differences with, and you have a real conflict, and you need to work that out. The hard part about that might be then on the other side, in contrast to protecting the relationship, is trying to represent your own point of view and trying to protect yourself in this. So that balance between protecting the relationship and protecting the self is what we try and pay close attention to, and whether being out of balance and resolving relationship conflict in either way, in an out of balance way, may lead to this kind of chronic stress in relationships. And we've hypothesized that unbalanced coping with conflict maintains low levels of chronic stress that then can increase the risk for depression. And we raised the notion that learning to maintain balance in relationship conflicts is first practiced in the home with parents, and later then developed in romantic relationships. So rather than thinking of parent-adolescent conflict as a bad thing, we want to push folks to think about it as something not to avoid, but as a really quite valuable practice session for trying to figure out how to maintain balance. And I'm going to fly through this. I don't want to be the one that goes over too much over my time. I just want to show you some of the behaviors that are related to depression in our adolescent and young older adolescent dating couples. And I particularly want to just focus on that first square. These are adolescent girls fighting with their mothers, I should say arguing with their mothers about an important conflict. And the behavior pattern we saw as related to depression is one where the girls had conflict, came in, tried to stand up for themselves, and then gave in. Really were submissive. They did it in very skillful ways so that the mother felt very connected and happy at the end of this. But those girls were the ones with the highest depression symptoms. And I can note that they also had these attenuated cortisol reactivity, which is a pattern we see connected to depression. For boys, and this is a place where gender starts to really show up, for boys it was a very different pattern in some ways. It was a disengaged submission, rather than really, the girls was a very protective submission, protective of the relationship. For boys, they were very disengaged, very withdrawn, and holding back, and it seemed to be more protective of the self rather than the relationship. For them, it was connected to depression, predicted depression a year later, and was related to elevated cortisol reactivity, which is the pattern we see related to depression for boys. So these things I've said I would want us to think about creating environments in homes to practice balance, tolerate and model balanced conflict, be alert with adolescents and adoptive adolescents perhaps for submission or arguing that seems to be fearful of losing the relationship, and on the other hand be alert for withdrawal that might be showing fear of losing the self in a conflict. Okay.
Okay, hopefully I won't have to do any math while I'm up here. Let's see. Okay, there I am. So, my name is John Sobraske, and I practice as an adoption psychotherapist in Rochester, New York. I've got to say it's a little painful to be here because I have a leaning toward research. I flirted with it for a while, and it's so nice to see all this powerful research, but it's also nice to hear some of the panel talk about, you know, where there isn't research yet, but we feel a need for it, and sometimes it's the clinicians that are a little bit attuned to that. So it reinvigorates that notion for me that it's important that we create a dialogue between research and practice, and I really appreciate that the conference has really, is really embodying that, those reciprocal domains that kind of feed each other. It's my belief that good research informs practice, but also that good practice ideally can be helpful to research. To this end, I am just beginning work on a project myself to try and help do some translation, more for the layperson and clinicians, and bridge these two areas a little bit. Oh. Talk about executive function here. Let's see. There we go.
And the arrow key will work.
Just the arrow key?
Yeah.
Just do that. Okay.
Down.
All right, so I work with all members of the adoption and foster care constellations across all age spans using a variety of modalities. With adult adoptees, I'm often finding that there's a bit of an inner child inside there. And those who are willing to do some depth work, I use a psychodynamic object relations, attachment-oriented experiential phenomenological approach. That's a mouthful. No research on that, definitely. That provides rich insight into an experience of intense, previously unconscious feelings generated by early abandonment and ongoing separation. Now, even though many of these adoptees would, as children, have been classified as securely attached, I believe, many nevertheless manifest abandonment fears and significant issues related to attachment and relationship. Now, part of the challenge in adoption is a lot of the issues are hidden. For a variety of reasons, many adoptees do not initially recognize such issues in their life, and I can't speak for all adoptees. Maybe some adoptees don't have those issues. It's so heterogeneous. And some of them do not recognize them as adoption-related until engaging in psychotherapy. Now, in the 70s, clinicians such as Annette Barron, Ruben Panor, Arthur Orofsky, and Ken Watson brought attention to many of these issues. These aspects of adoption are difficult to research. I think Dr. Scherer talked about how there's not much empirical data there, and I would agree, they're not well represented in the literature, and yet clinically, I do see these things. Such feelings are also rarely presented by media. The society, I don't think, always understands the kind of underbelly, underlying feelings that sometimes accompany the adoption experience. But fortunately, we have places like FMB that are helping with that. I'd say because of this, members of the adoption triad do not always have touchstones in society to help organize and understand their own internal experience. So it's a kind of confusion, a lot of belonging issues, but also where do I belong? Do I belong to those who say there might be some issues in adoption, or do I want to push that away because that's too pathologizing? So that gets tricky. Another challenge here with previously maltreated or institutionalized adopter or foster youth is the presence of many psychological issues at the same time. Scientific research tries to reduce variables, reassembling these component elements into a complex model that accounts for intricate interactive patterns. That can be challenging. Clinicians need to address all the relevant interactive issues within the individual, the families, the care system, and community. Too often, however, clinical or social service specialization leads to a focus on one issue to the exclusion of others. This is like the 6 blind men and the elephant, where a tusk is misapprehended as a saber and a tail as a rope, and no one can discern the whole elephant. Now, some of the things that are talked about a lot recently, early malnutrition or exposures, genetically based mental emotional disorders. But the big 3 that I see talked about a lot in the clinical world are attachment, trauma, and executive function. Now, attachment was pretty popular in the 80s, 90s. It's fallen off a little bit in the clinical realm because of some of those questionable therapies. And it's really been upstaged by trauma, which has come on really strong in the last 15 years. But I've got to say, in my practice, I'm really glad to hear so much of this talked about today. The big issue is executive function. I find that when the brain's working right, when people can self-regulate, when they can manage a little bit of coordination between different brain functions, a lot of things get better, including trauma, including attachment. So I really think that's going to be the next giant area in research and practice. Now, those three areas, trauma, attachment, and executive function, I think present some real paradoxes. For example, a child may need the safety of an attachment figure while working through trauma. On the other hand, the child may need to work through trauma in order to be able to closely relate to an attachment figure. Yet because both trauma and attachment work can be triggering, doing both at the same time may not be possible. Similarly, attachment facilitates executive function facilitates attachment. Fortunately, these two areas can usually be addressed simultaneously, although in certain cases, one may need to precede the other. It's going to take a couple more minutes because of my technical problem here. Russian dolls, some adoptees, I think this is such a good metaphor for a lot of adoptees, particularly those maltreated or institutionalized, are developmentally diffuse, as if manifesting a range of ages, though tending toward delayed. They can, in some respects, also be precocious. Some have deficits, we might call them Swiss cheese holes, which may partially compromise or fully impede certain developmental steps, but steps can usually be returned to at a later time outside of their usual sequence in order to do more work on them. One of the big challenges, I think, in the teen years is a potential bottleneck. There can be that resetting, like Dr. Gunner talked about, but there can also be so many things that have to go forward that they all kind of compress and get a little bit bottlenecked. So that can be very, very challenging. And again, I think it's the executive function that helps. Some kids, they just struggle so much to look competent. There's such a pressure to be good with peers that they may try and leapfrog ahead, doing things that are pseudo-adult, smoking, a lot of those risk behaviors, being sexual, hypersexual, trying to vault forward to power and privilege, maybe to make up for some ways that they're not filled in all those cheese holes underneath. And I will leapfrog here to the very end. I would say that in identity, one of the challenges here is that you often have normal adolescent identity. You also have potentially adoption identity, birth versus adoptive self. Sometimes those things are really coming on strong during adolescence, some of that temperament manifesting finally. And then you have transracial, transcultural. And in some cases, they go in a sequence. Maybe it's unique for each person. Sometimes they come all at once, and then you've got kind of a triple whammy that's hard to do. And then finally, you may have a masking. So a child who's adopted transracially may really focus on the transracial, transcultural issues and not really look at birth, family, aside from the cultural piece, not look at some of those deeper lying adoption issues, or you could have the complete opposite. So I think sometimes with research and self-reports, we have to be a little careful that there may be more going on than the child is conscious of, and it may just come out at a later time. Okay, thank you very much.